everybody. I've got another introduction to the time period for you, but I'm going to be honest in saying that trying to cover the 20th and 21st century in one video, or even just one introduction, is not really feasible. So please make sure you read the introduction to this period and all the introductions I assign to you, because there's so much happening all at once, we can't cover it all. But today I'm going to hit some of the highlights. We're first going to start with talking about the historical focus of what's changing in history and events happening that are directly affecting Britain. So this is going to be very British-based, British-focused. So there's other things going on too, but we're focusing on the UK and how they're changing historically. So this is an age of triumph of science, invention, technology, and social welfare. We can't take that away from that. There's a lot of great things happening, but it's also tied to a period of great tragedy, and that conflict is what's going to drive a lot of the mentality and artistic changes we'll talk about later. During this period, three very important things happen relatively quickly, all before the end of the 20th century. There's two world wars where countless lives are lost. We, meaning the UK, has to give up a lot of their investments to pay for wars and losses, which means they lose their empire, and they also lose some of their status as the financial capital of the world for a little while. They lose a dominant position in world politics, which connects to what I just mentioned to you, loss of empire, loss of financial status. But one positive thing that happens is they do achieve the full political democracy, which raises their standard of living and also creates a welfare state, so people are getting education and health and food and all these things that to become more stable. In 1899 to 1902, there was the Anglo-Boer War, which was protested and eventually was seen as a war of shame for their imperial pursuits. But it ends right as Edward VII takes over, so we have our Edwardian period that's going to last until about 1910, which is full of wealthy excess, lots of self-indulgence. So if we think about the roaring 1920s, and we picture all this glam and money, it's beginning now, like they're going crazy excessive, which causes creators of all kinds, so artists, musicians, writers, etc., to kind of keep their distance from the wealthy upper class. They don't really want to be associated with that. They want to have some distance. And you can see it, as one textbook calls it, that as it containing the economic and social stability of the Victorian age, combined with the level of ideas of a sense and change and liberation. So like we still have our ideals, economic and social stability, which is why we can be so excessive, but because we're being like, ooh, things are changing for the better and liberation is happening, woo, we kind of go over the top. That does end when George V takes over for the Georgian period, and a balance is brought back, which is great, we're enjoying it, but then very quickly World War I hits. In World War I, we lose about 1 million lives, just in the UK. Battalions were also organized by city, so if they're like, the Birmingham battalion was wiped out, the city's young men were wiped up typically. So, a whole city is losing everything, their workforce, their future, families, so there's a lot of devastation. We see a lot of patriotic feelings at home that don't match the reality the troops are facing, and so in the first week of readings, we look at our war poets, that a lot of that is reflected there, so I don't want to go into that too much. We lose this optimism that progress can continue forever, that we were just enjoying the first 10 years of this century. We lose that optimism because all these changes that were happening brought about this devastation. A lot of young writers are going to turn away from public affairs because they're kind of disgusted by it, they're overwhelmed by it, they want to focus on the inner mind, so psychology is becoming really important. We just lose this illusion of the idea that the world is good. There's too many collapses happening, too many changes happening, that causes people to feel like the world isn't good, it's bad. So 25% of the world at the start of the war was under British control. By the end of it, it's no longer true. So in 1907, parts of the colonies are now self-governing. We have the Commonwealth status, and other national movements are gaining traction. So 1921, 1922, Ireland gains their freedom, so that's another loss. And then in the 1930s, we start leaning heavily left for better answers. So we're looking at socialism, communism, and liberalism. But the start of World War II pushed people back to the center because they didn't want to be associated with Hitler and the Soviet Union and the things they were doing. So World War II damages more property than than the loss of men, which was great. However, the empire is going to end. During the World War, though, morale is seemingly higher. There's less casualties. Churchill's the prime minister, and he's great at speaking and like boosting that morale. Young writers are less impacted by this because there's not as much of an internal turmoil as there was in the previous World War. We also get the British Arts Council, who starts giving grants to nonprofits who build these cultural projects, and we start seeing a massive change in hearing from people who are not just your traditional wealthy London kind of connection. We are ending the empire, though, which is great for literature because we start seeing a hybridization of culture. So taking traditional forms and stories and writing them in English or bringing them together with those ideals from the UK. People are starting to move to the UK in large numbers. However, immigration is quickly cracked down on. People are not warmly welcomed, even though they're British citizens. And they're part of the empire, they're still seen as the other and they aren't welcome. So tension starts developing between the people coming in as British citizens who aren't seen as traditional British. And so they have this tension of like, we're being rejected, we have to give up our culture. So what do we do? And it starts to really redevelop what it means to be British in general. For the ladies, because we've talked about women's rights throughout, in 1882, wives can now own property. Universities are starting to admit women. In 1918, the first right for voting happens for women, but you have to be over 30. 1928, that drops down to 21 plus. And then in 1979, we have the first female prime minister, who also happens to be the longest tenured prime minister in the 20th century, and that was Margaret Thatcher. So things are looking up. Okay, so mentality. This is where we start to see a lot of different changes. So as I mentioned earlier, things were happening so quickly that everyone felt like they just had to kind of turn their backs in a way. Because yes, this was great technology and improvement, but bad things are happening. I pulled a quote from another textbook that says the rate and intensity of sociocultural and technological change came to seem almost unbearable. And it really is how they felt. They felt like they couldn't handle much more of this chaotic. So we see this deliberate and radical shift from tradition that we haven't really seen before. And when we say deliberate, I mean people were saying like, I don't want to be like this. Like that's unacceptable. Let's do the opposite. And instead of really believing in like religion or things are happening to change the world, it's now that mankind can shape the world how he wants it to be. We see this failure in the Enlightenment ideals and goals, which is the idea of humanity was going to be protected by science and rationality was going to help them. That fails, which leads to the deliberate change because we had horrific genocides, environmental disasters, exploitation is happening in the government world and work worlds. We want to drop the Victorian approaches to areas of life because they are too traditional. And we're questioning and striving for our alternatives, but we're not all striving to the same way. We are moving away from our conviction and our optimism, and we are becoming skeptics and bleak. And honestly, World War I was a huge part of this change. We're questioning our traditions. We are no longer trusting the assumptions we just always believed in. And they really did believe that anything associated with the world before the war had to be condemned or ignored because that's what produced World War I for them. And they no longer wanted that. So we have to, if we're turning our backs, we have to have new ways to think. Anthropology and psychoanalysis is growing, so study of culture and how people are thinking. Religion is just greatly dropping off from what it had been. There's a flood of new and possibly frightening ideas for people. Nietzsche is saying there's no absolute truth. Culture is variant and situational. Culture is not a universal thing. Freud is questioning if humans are even rational or aware of themselves. Darwin is showing that humans could be half animal and governed by chance, not design or reason. So this is exciting and frightening at the same time. We also start seeing people question their identity in a post-colonial world. Like, what does it mean to be British? Do I have to choose? If I was someone whose country was colonized, I have to now feel like I have to choose between my original culture that was destroyed or this British culture I've grown up in. And so there's a lot of tension there and happening. But some good things is that, this is the development of individualism and capitalism and urbanization. And there are some positive technological and political progresses that are key for us to be the society we are today. Because without this chaos, without these changes that will feel weird as we're reading them or extreme, we wouldn't be the society we are today. So in the artistic world, we start seeing a lot of changes as well. One of which is the aesthetic movement, which is the idea of art for art's sake, which is now going to create a gap, a very large gap that we had started to narrow between creators and the general public. Compulsory education, at least through elementary school, is happening in the UK, so there is a rise in the literate audience. And so because of that, some creators were like, oh, they don't understand, we need to keep them far away. So they're purposely making themselves obscure and difficult to understand because they want to appeal to a small cultural group. They don't want everybody to deal with this, to understand what they're saying. And they want to be elevated and sophisticated. And this is also not every creator, as we'll see in a second. But they want this elevation, this sophistication. And part of this is a threat of the growing mass media. They feel like mass media is crazy and the ordinary person has plenty of trash to entertain themselves, but we are going to be true literature and art, and you have to think about us. Whereas previously we've seen there is some of that distinction, but it's not as hard of a gap and it's not as purposeful. But as I just teased, not all artists are doing the same. Some writers are rejecting the push of modernization. Some are going along with it like, yes, this is great. No matter what their perspective, they all articulate the effects of modernity's relentless change, loss, and destabilization. Because everyone felt it, whether they wanted to acknowledge it or not, however they felt about it or not. And so our literary responses are going to vary drastically based off who the person is and what their background is. And one exciting news is that London is no longer the strict voice of Britain. We get regional dialects and regional creators on the island being spoken for. You don't have to use the London accent. It could be anything. And also other people from the Commonwealth are giving their voices, and it's all just developing in this really fun, exciting way. So while this is a hard time period to get a full grasp on, I think there's some great things we'll see.